Welcome to this episode of Beyond the Numbers of Retirement and Longevity Planning. I'm your host, Reed Stone. Alongside me is my co-host, Bob Foley, and our guest today is Jonthan Ainsley. Imagine a world where aging isn't about fading away, but instead one that is about flourishing with purpose and vitality. Our guest today is the visionary driving that revolution. Jonthan is a Gallup-Certified strengths coach and founder of InvestInU. As a speaker and consultant on the topic of flourishing longevity, Jonthan enjoys helping teams thrive and individuals soar, and seeing ageism crumble, one inspired mindset at a time. His Flourishing Longevity Advisor Program has financial advisors and their clients alike rethinking what it means to successfully live a 100-year life. With a long career spanning firms including Merrill Lynch, Schwab, and SunTrust, coaching and consulting with advisors, he's turned this expertise into a groundbreaking force for longevity planning. Jonthan is here to help us redefine our future. Jonthan, welcome. We're glad to have you with us and excited to learn more about flourishing longevity.
Thank you, Reed.
So let's start, Jonthan, with I just want to get a little bit more of your background because you've worked in the financial advice space, you've worked with financial advisors, you've coached them, you've consulted with them. So how did all of that experience kind of lead you to this longevity planning area?
Well, thanks, Reed. It's been a fascinating journey. So I've actually been involved with financial services for nearly 40 years. And as you can probably tell from my accent, I originate out of the UK, but have been in Central Florida for the last 25 years. And originally I was sort of in the bond market as a broker back in the UK, then reinventing myself when I arrived here in Central Florida. I spent some time client-facing with SunTrust, and then nearly 20 years ago, joined Schwab as a relationship manager, working with independent advisors who use their platform. And Schwab was at the forefront of developing practice management resources. And the mantra was go become a virtual partner with your advisors. So for the next 5 years, I picked that ball up and ran with it and had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that side of the equation. And I actually got some fairly healthy recommendations on LinkedIn. And that led to me joining Merrill Lynch and spending 7 years with them, starting in, I think it was 2012, and working throughout the Southeast from Birmingham, Alabama, south, and desk to desk, office to office. And post Bank of America merger, you also had the onslaught of fintech. And Vanguard came out with their piece about Advisor Alpha. And Merrill did a pretty good job. They teamed up with Ken Dykewald and AgeWave. They created all these resources around what they called the 7 life priorities. So looking beyond just finance. And they actually did a webinar on, are you ready to live to 100? So in conversations with teams, I'd ask them how they were using the resources. And the refrain was pretty much universal. Along the lines of, we plan our clients to 95 or 100, and they all say, that's not going to be me. I don't want to be old and decrepit. And as I heard that, I realized that it was very reminiscent to my own sort of family history. And so my grandmother, for instance, spent pretty much 30 years promising me that each year would be her last because she was too old and frail to go on, made it to just shy of 101. I had an uncle here in Central Florida, wired to hit the golf course at 65, did so, then got bored senseless playing golf 4 times a week, being sloshed by lunchtime for the next 25 years. And so the more I heard this, I thought, this is a big deal. We ought to be looking at this more. And my original suggestion to the advisors was, why don't you create a small advisory panel, go to your clients and run the topic of longevity past them, ask for their advice and feedback, and let's just see what comes back. And one of the teams asked me if I'd put something together. And so I did. I created this workshop. The second one I did was in the villages. And at the end of it, I had a 65-year-old man write, "This program shows you it's all about the next 40 years, not just about the dollars." And so, how many 65-year-old men or women are considering what the next 40 years might look like? And that's what we sort of discovered when it started as an exercise in looking for feedback from clients. Another part of this was creating an experience for the clients that was inviting, because typically most people, per the old and decrepit, they don't particularly, that conversation about aging isn't something most people are comfortable having because they don't really know how to have it. And so I sort of stumbled upon success in getting these sort of reactions from clients, and from that build it out into advisors saying, well, hang on a minute, no one's actually training us how to have this conversation. So, adding into the client experience of creating these workshops, which ultimately are for all age groups as well. That's been the other element of this, is when you've got a 24-year-old saying this is amazing, and you've got a 93-year-old at the other end of the spectrum, this isn't limited to any particular age group. So we're in a world of discovery right now with this, and we'll see where it goes.
So help us better understand, and I want to get your perspective on the topic of both longevity and longevity planning. And then how does longevity and longevity planning help people? It's really changing the whole retirement concept and the retirement phase of life. Longevity is this big factor. So tell us a little bit about longevity and longevity planning, and how that's changing retirement planning, especially for clients and financial advisors too.
Well, it's again, I'm sort of making it up as I go along, but it is fascinating. So, in creating this workshop and using the term longevity, I had an advisor who participated, he coined it flourishing longevity. So suddenly you're looking at that. I then, again on this journey, had the president of the Florida Council of Aging. I took him through the workshop, who he is also the state director of ARP. And he started saying, well, look, Jonthan's created this program that shifts mindsets from ones of fear and frailty to ones of opportunity and promise. And I think this becomes the thing. I've started now with the workshops where I'll actually ask people at the start, you don't need me to tell you that many are living far longer than they expected. And then as an exercise, I'll say, can you now put your hand up if you've got a family member who's made it to at least 80, even if they're alive or not? And virtually every hand goes up. And you get people look around the room and say, just look at this. And now what about 90? And they're sort of 60%-ish or thereabouts, and then 100. And then you say, and it's probably fair to say that most of those did not set out at an earlier age with an intention to live that long. What does it look like if we start looking at reframing and redefining what it means to successfully age? And building into that, again, as this evolution occurs, if you think the whole retirement model was created nearly 100 years ago in the depths of the Great Depression, where 65 was set as the sort of the key, figure, and that's what we still have. And it's not that there hasn't been work around this. Ken Dykewald, again, he in the Harvard Business Review 21 years ago now wrote an article or co-authored an article, let's retire retirement. And yet here we are. And, you look in the dictionary, retirement is about withdrawal and retreat. And that typically, like my grandmother, that's the model people have had to go off. And like her, how much life did she miss out on? Because beyond 65, she thought that was it. There was no real expectation of what could really be ahead for me. Turn that around to this mindset shift, the paradigm shift that the workshop creates, where you then get a 65-year-old saying, oh my gosh, 40 years, well, I have no idea. Well, that's fine, but let's start exploring, what does that look like? And, you then create this world of opportunity that most people aren't looking at in that sense.
So let's talk about, I want to know a little bit more about the whole idea of flourishing longevity. And I know you kind of coined that with a financial advisor came up with that term. But how do you define that, or what components are part of flourishing longevity?
Well, so duality to that, and what I mean is, just over this last weekend, I came across on YouTube a 103-year-old being interviewed. And, World War II vet, born, I think it was a couple of years old. So let's say, it was born in 1921. But what really captured my imagination was A, he does not use a walking stick, and B, takes no medication.
Wow.
And yeah, exactly. Wow. So I'm sitting there going, gosh, I want some of that. So, as you lean into this thing, and again, it's just been so amazing pulling on all the different threads. And originally with the workshop, I used Dan Buettner's Blue Zones TED Talk. There's been the series released more recently, but there is a TED Talk he gave on how to live to 100 plus. And as you work your way through that, he starts with the Danish twin study, which suggests that only 20% of our longevity is down to our DNA. He references, or the Danish twin study references, the other 80% is down to lifestyle. Well, what determines our lifestyle? It's our thinking. And there have actually been other studies that suggest it's a 793 split. But either way, this idea that how we are approaching it, our mindset in the way we're approaching it, and again, when you start looking at the different realms of what constitutes mindset, so just being open to the possibility of living a longer life. You mentioned the 100. It's not about living forever, but it's a little bit like baseball, where kids are trained. You don't stop running till you hit first base, regardless of what happens. And so the idea of getting to 65 and then looking around and going, well, okay, now what? With uncertainty, so 65 plus plus plus. So, shifting mindset, number one. Then you've got physical health. And the good news is, you don't have to be in the gym pumping iron every day. But if you're not continuing to move and flex and things like that, then you've got metabolic health. And if you, went back 6 years ago and had a conversation with Jonthan, sugar, processed food, all of that stuff, I knew nothing about intermittent fasting or things like that. And, I hasten to add, I am not a doctor. What suits one person may not suit someone else. But coming back to that framework of intentionality, helping position with people, well, what does metabolic health mean to you? And again, most people will look around, part of the workshop, I'll lay out there that 12.4 years of chronic illness is the average in this country. And I'll look at attendees and say, and what's your number going to be? And what are you doing to reduce it from 12.4? And oh, by the way, ladies, 14.7 is your number. And so who would really want that for themselves if they understood that's the way they're going? So again, metabolic health. Then you've got purpose, passion, vitality, fulfillment, things like that. So, having a purpose. In Okinawa and Japan, they do not have the word retirement in their vocabulary. It's ikigai, it's your purpose. Why do you get out of bed every day? My most surprising thing in this journey has been around the impact and the importance of community. So that's the next part of the sort of flourishing longevity paradigm. And then finally, both financial education and financial fitness. And so, again, helping people shift mindsets around what that looks like. And you see the data of how ill prepared people are. And even at the other end of the spectrum, even if people are high net worth individuals, having that financial plan, but how does that flow into all the other realms of those, ultimately the overall 6 component parts? So just this year, we've created the Flourishing Longevity Scorecard. So you can go and take an assessment with 60 questions, 10 for each of those things I've outlined, 6 things, and create a score. And okay, great. What would you now most benefit from focusing on?
And people are overwhelmed by it. It's absolutely, they're in absolute denial. And the funny thing is that society doesn't prepare you for these 40 years after 65. As a matter of fact, society kind of wants to shut you down and put you off on the corner over here and maybe put you in assisted living or even better, a nursing home, and just warehouse you until it's your turn to go. And you see all of that, especially with the baby boomer and the Gen X generation, we're going to have none of that. Please, I'm not going to one of those places. Shoot me before that. Well, let's see how you are at 85 and if you still want to be shot, So I guess the big question is, how do we turn this attitude around? How do we get employers to understand that people 65 plus can still contribute greatly? You may have to refocus the kind of work that they do, and you may want to do that for your own profitability. But at the same time, we can't just warehouse people and think for 40 years that they're just going to be there and be square.
And not only can they, Bob, but I think a lot of people do want to contribute some way.
Yeah.
So, and that's perfect. I mean, I think with, the whole lockdown scenario, it's left people even more with an inkling something is missing. And again, this work is fascinating. And again, we're not reinventing the wheel here. If you think about it, JFK in the 60s was talking about, putting more years in our life, not just life in our years. Did I get that right? But fast forward, Andrew J. Scott is a professor at the London School of Economics. His book, The Longevity Imperative, last year, a few key takeaways from that. Get ready to redefine what it means to be human. I mean, that I still find mind-blowing, and I've been cogitating on that for a year, and I have no idea what that really means. But the idea of it, oh my gosh, wow. On top of that, you've then got this is the greatest gift. I think, again, back to Ken Dykewald, something like, 65% of all humans who've ever reached 65 are still alive. Yet we have no blueprint for living it meaningfully beyond 65. Back to Andrew J. Scott again, he also dials into that people aren't planning far enough in the future to avoid these years of chronic illness, this difference between, lifespan and health span, and closing that. And then also, as he points out, only 2.5% of healthcare expenditure in the Western world is preventative. So by and large, our reaction to aging overall, no matter what age, is reactive, not intentional. Right. And so, Bob, and I just want to touch, I'm seeing more traction outside of financial services. So I've touched on AARP. In 2 weeks' time, I have been invited to participate in the AARP's Global Thought Leadership Conference, Unlocking Healthy Longevity. 2 weeks ago, I was in Tallahassee at the FSU College of Medicine, and I was the keynote presenter, same thing that I did for the Florida Council on Aging, Flourishing in the Age of Longevity, and it was for the Alzheimer's Project's educational conference. You've touched on independent care places. I see how can you recreate that experience, and I'm already having conversations in that realm. So rather than just treating people for their increasing decrepitness, creating an environment where you create, communities that help propel people in the right direction and really, elevate what they're up to. Well-being programs. I've just been introduced to or connected to the biggest health provider here in Central Florida. And in a couple of weeks' time, I'll be having a conversation with their head of strategy. So who knows where that goes. And just for good measure, yesterday, I agreed with one of the top 100 colleges. We're going to pilot the Flourishing Longevity Program powered by InvestInU within their athletics program. So that's going all the way back to the sort of the 20-year-olds. And some of my best workshops have been with 20-year-olds, but talking to them about what does getting to 120 look like for you?
Yeah.
And not only,
go ahead, Bob.
But not only that, but it's this whole idea about what a community looks like with all this longevity involved. And, everybody looks at retirement and they think, great, it's spring break for seniors. You're going to play golf. You're going to run on the beach, and that these are all the images that are thrown at us. And of course, what happens is after about 6 to 9 months of that and travel, et cetera, well, you start to say, is that all there is? And after you say, is that all there is? Then you have to say to yourself, well, then what is it?
Right. Right.
And I think that's where you're coming from, Jonathan, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, again, another part of the fun of being at the epicenter of this. So having created a safe environment to get people to engage around, just talking about longevity, clients then came back and said, well, okay, we want more now. Well, all right, what do you want more on? Purpose. Well, Richard Lader's got purpose covered all over the place out there. So it's not that purpose isn't being addressed. But then I thought, well, hang on a minute. If you think we as humans are a little bit like computers, we're born with with our natural operating system, I call it our natural essence or me 1.0, then we take on the malware at an early age, the ego, to start adapting and being able to deal with life. So fast forward to whatever age you're at. And one of the things for the second workshop, I'm a big fan of sort of doing pre-work and engaging and things like that. So participants, the ask is sit down, shut your eyes, take some deep breaths, picture yourself as a small child at play. And then when I get them into the workshop, I say, okay, did you find that word? And now out of 10, how much has that word shown up in your life? So if we're going to forward look on planning what purpose looks like for you, let's make sure you're integrating that word into whatever you're planning. Because the other element of this, I mean, again, there's so much fun around this. 20 to 60 and 60 to 100 are the same time frame, 40 years. And when you start talking to people about what happens if 20 to 60 is just the warm up, what happens if 60 to 100 becomes the real performance of our lifetime? Because when Jonthan turned 60 4 years ago, how much was I in a better position at 60 than I was at 20? I may not go back out and run a 3-hour marathon again, but I have all this worldly knowledge and experience. And how can that be utilized, especially if I'm doing something that lights me up? I mean, that can become the other thing. We get on the treadmill of life through the 20 to 60, a little bit like Maslow and, the hierarchy, and taking care of the physiological side. But then we've got the opportunity on 60 to 100 to look at the, self-realization and more focus in that channel. So, just going out and doing a check the box exercise, which may involve, it's not that volunteering isn't a bad thing, but is your volunteering lighting you up? Is what you're doing nourishing you? The idea of lifetime learning. How is what you're doing? What did you miss out on? And what could you still go and do? And I know I'm on a bit of a rant, but I do want to share this. I was in a coffee shop not so long ago, and there are 3 folks sitting there, and this lady's beaming away. And she pointed at the guy next to her and said, it's my husband's 70th birthday today. So I looked at him and I said, well, congratulations. What are you going to do for the next 30 years? And sharp as a tack, she shot back and said, well, that would make him 100. And I said, yeah, many are living far longer than they expected. And looking at him again, I said, what is possible for you? What could you still go and accomplish over the next 30 years? And you could see his energy shifted because no one had talked to him in those terms before. And obviously he didn't have an answer, but I have no doubt that changed his birthday and probably changed the trajectory of his life. And we didn't get into what I do or anything like that, but just posing that question changed his view on what his future might look like.
Absolutely. And, the other thing about it is not only changes people's attitudes towards it, but the whole thing is, let's get back around the financial advisory world. Okay. So what's in it for me as a financial advisor? If I have a client that's going to live to be 100, I mean, he's going to spend down all of his money, isn't he? Or how's that all going to work?
Well, again, what are you being paid for as a financial advisor? You know, I can go to Schwab and get a retirement plan without talking to another human.
Right.
So, you know, part of the conversation I had at Merrill Lynch, I was in Dothan, Alabama, and one of the team looking at the goals worksheet said, "We're helping our clients think." Well, bingo. Yes, you are. So and I'll get to the bit about the sort of the withdrawal and the drawdown, but I think, again, we've got to change how we're thinking overall. And again, I feel fortunate because when you spent 7 years going desk to desk to desk, my insight into how advisors work is fairly different from most. You know, there I am helping them. And a lot of advisors, they had what's called the Advisor Growth Network at Merrill. And one of the top advisors, it was at a leadership meeting, and he came down from New York. The first thing he said is, everyone in the field is operating out of fear. And that becomes the thing. Advisors were brought in typically to be salespeople. It didn't mean to say, and again, it was interesting working on both sides of the divide of the fiduciary world of the RIA, but then also the the broker-dealer side. I worked with plenty of CFPs when I was at Merrill Lynch, and the absence of training. I've had an FPA chapter chair say to me, "This is the planning that's not being done." Well, the FPA want to legally own title to retirement planning, but there is nothing in what they do. There is no threshold around longevity planning. Fundamental to portfolio management is cost basis. There is no basis for know your client. And again, the absence of actually training advisors and educating clients, simply asking a client, "Hey, what are your goals?" They have no point of reference. They don't know. It's like my grandmother. "Well, I'll be dead next year." Well, maybe yes, maybe no. But coming back to, what does your financial situation look like? You know, Warren Buffett's still working. You know, there are plenty out there. By changing our views, I'm 64. I hope and expect to be able to continue generating some sort of revenue into my 80s or beyond. I don't know. But this idea of, okay, here's this finite pot of money. And don't forget, this experiment occurred from the 70s and 80s onwards, when companies came off paying pensions and said, "Hey, you're on your own now, good luck." And in many ways, it's uncharted territory. So the idea of how this is all going to work, which, you know, again, it concerns me. I've actually had conversations in the last week with both FINRA and the SEC, because as the director of education and investor education and advocacy at the SEC, she penned a piece on women and investing. And in that, she said, retirement plans should include longevity. Well, great. Where are we delivering that? What is the client's lived experience? And it may well be, Bob, yeah, what does this look like at the end of the day into the 90s or 100s? And I had that conversation with advisors at Merrill. I would ask them, well, what are you planning your clients to? And by the way, how much money are you leaving with them? And a lot of advisors, to be fair, would say, well, we're leaving them 50% of what they've got today. That's the modeling we're doing. So if they get to 95, they've still got at least 50% of what they've got today. Now, who knows what happens with inflation and things like that. But again, the idea of changing how we're thinking, I think, is a front and center. And again, this untapped potential we are all sitting on. I mean, to me, it's off the charts. And we've kind of shot ourselves in the foot in terms of, and again, Ken Dykewell talks of this, in creating these retirement communities in the 70s, let's say, you now have, 120,000 people around Ocala in just outside Orlando, and there's no multi-generational spread. You go to other countries and culturally, the older folk are revered, but they haven't gone running off and saying, "Hey, it's all about me now, see ya." And so part of what we've got to do is get back to the connectivity part of the equation, but also, again, back to the money. Social security, I mean, of course, that is just, if you take a simple look at that, the math doesn't work, yet what's being done about it?
People are running from it. They're running from it.
Yeah. Yeah. But,
because they have nothing to replace it with. They haven't even thought about that.
And that becomes the thing. I mean, again, top to bottom, it fascinates me because the thought leadership in terms of, so much of it is reactive. Yeah, we need more sidewalks and we need, where are people going to live in place? These things are important. Please don't get me wrong. But in terms of harnessing the untapped potential, people are approaching aging or older age with low expectations. And that can go all the way into the 20s. When my daughter turned 25, she was lamenting being halfway to 50. We're sowing the seeds of ageism at early ages. But these conversations, how do we spread this on a broader context? It fascinates me. Sticking in financial services, I think the hidden risk that they're sitting on, I call it the longevity coin. And on one side, I've had advisors get $17 million referrals. I had another 30-year CFP at Ameriprise. A client of hers of 22 years had never given her a referral. She got 4 referrals from this guy by just turning up to the workshop. So when you look at all the metrics that are important to advisory firms, this program becomes a force multiplier. But the flip side of that is the Achilles heel. If you are not addressing longevity risk and opportunity and providing better longevity planning, to what extent is that actually a ticking time bomb, which no one seems to be recognizing right now? And, what risk mitigation do you need to offset that?
Absolutely. Well, rather than deal with it, they're just leaving it and they're denying it. And then as we go through the denial, it just becomes time just keeps passing. And as the time passes, people keep aging, and it's just gonna hit a wall as we all know. Reed, back to you.
I want to go back to a couple of things you said, Jonathan, because I think there's 2 things that I want to talk about that I think are really important. And the first one is talking about the financial services industry. And when you spoke to this woman who was the head of, I can't remember what, when she said that longevity planning needs to be part of the conversation, I think that's where there needs to be a distinction or a line drawn in that. In the financial advice industry, I think a lot of times when they talk about longevity planning, they're just looking at the financial piece of it. And so sometimes and this kind of goes back to that article that you and I talked about too, that was recently in one of the financial advisor publications. They were talking about it in the term, and I think it might have even been in the title where they were talking about longevity planning. But as you and I went through it, and there's a research paper behind that, the whole idea of longevity planning is all about just the financial side. How do we create enough income for the person to live to age 100 or 120? Okay, that's part of it. But as you pointed out in your longevity program, and as the 3 of us know from working with clients and studying this, there are so many other topics that are non-financial that go into this. When you talk about purpose, and you talk about health, and you talk about social connections, and all of these other things that are interrelated, they're all connected, and they do have even a connection to the financial side. But I think one of the, and you mentioned this too, where there's kind of this missing piece that the financial advice industry is not getting, and that's what I think they're not getting, is they're not really connecting what longevity planning is. When people say, we want to help clients with longevity planning, it's just the financial side. So that's kind of one of the points that I'd be glad to get your feedback on. And then the second thing I wanted to jump back in, this kind of ties into when you were talking about what a flourishing longevity plan entails. I think one of the pieces that isn't talked about enough, and it isn't talked about in what Bob and I do on the retirement coaching kind of side of things too, is the whole idea of our mindset and how we can affect people's mindset about, and I think just one of the things that you talked about in your workshop, if people understood that if you just think about age 20 to 60 is 40 years, like you said, but age 60 to 100 is also 40 years. If people just kind of thought through that, because if you tell people, if they're 30 or 40 years old, they're going to think, oh my gosh, when I get to 60, things are kind of done. And we're not seeing that. So that's kind of two things I'd like to get your thoughts on, both longevity planning just being thought of from a financial perspective, and then also this whole mindset or going into the what I call the second half of life with a little more optimism. I call it there's opportunities and possibilities. So we have to be aware of the opportunities, the possibilities, but then we also have to know that there might be challenges as we go from age 60 to 70 to 80 to 90. There's all these different things that occur on that journey. So any thoughts on any of that, Jonthan?
Let me see. That was wonderfully put. So coming to the first thing, again, I feel so fortunate and honored in the things I've heard. I've had advisors say things to me like, a portfolio manager, for instance, I've always hidden behind the numbers, but now I don't have to. I can meet the clients where it's important to them. Other advisors, this is much more fun than asset allocation conversations. And I think that there is this thing that advisors, again, it takes so much to create. You think of the success rate to make it in the industry is very small. So if you've made it, there is that fear factor built in, and making that adjustment. Then you've got management. And I think so, again, I experienced this at Merrill. I used to be involved in the top of the house and be part of the divisionals review with Jonthan out of New York. So you knew what was coming, what they wanted. But as one advisor who used to go to New York, he came back and said, I don't get it, the way they talk in New York versus what you get in the field. And so I think where firms have made some level of effort, let's say, and you've got different things out there, Edward Jones, Merrill as well. You look at Raymond James, but how does that then relate to the client experience? And again, all too often, It's about widgets and numbers. And back to this dynamic, how can you really make prudent financial decisions on behalf of your client unless the client really understands themselves, the longevity literacy of, okay, what is your approach to your health? I think the average at the moment is over 300 grand in long-term care costs. Well, what does that really mean in itself? How many clients understand this? Flip side of that is this idea. So a good school friend of mine, I've known him since I was 11. We bought our little 50cc mopeds together when we were 16. He fell off his Yami 250 when he turned 17 within about 6 days and went into traction for 6 months in hospital. Then went into the repo market in the UK in the financial services world. He retired last year. Guess what he's doing now? He's teaching people how to ride motorbikes.
Okay.
So he's not having to dip into his retirement savings because he can live cash neutral by virtue of actually living his passion.
Right.
And so, again, helping advise, I mean, it's so fascinating, Reed.
And that connects, Jonthan, to the financial part. But if we're not having those conversations about what people are going to do, that actually does, in many cases, just like your friend, that affects the financial planning that is done for living a longer life.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on something else here, Reed. So most advisors have not figured out their own flourishing longevity for themselves. And that in itself, so having created the initial sort of training, we then created an online 6-module program. And I've had an Ameriprise complex director take himself through it. He's a practicing CFP. He wrote to his 150 advisors here in Florida and said, hey, you all should be taking a look at this. Not a single bite. And he was, again, they're on their treadmill. So never came back to it. But in creating that workshop, because we don't, the training program, the 6 modules, by not doing the workshop, I had to say, well, okay, how do you replicate that? The first 2 modules are all about advisors and their own flourishing longevity for themselves. So getting them comfortable in talking with themselves and their loved ones. So again, this conversation often doesn't happen. I've had a CFP as a result of the 2 workshops come back and say, I'm having conversations with my wife of 40 years that I've never had before. So again, you're creating this environment of conversation, but by getting advisors, The flip side of this, the feeding frenzy that is out there around mergers and acquisition, but no one is looking at the human side of this. And I walked into one of the office managers at Merrill, stayed in touch with me. I walked into his home not so long ago, and he looked at me and he said, "Did you hear about X?" And I said, "No, what about X?" Well, X was one of the top financial advisors for Merrill Lynch in Central Florida, worth over $25 million, blew his brains out within a year of retiring. And the manager said to me, this was avoidable. And we talked about, what I'm up to. He said, if he'd had this conversation, I don't think that would have happened. And so again, and it's not just within financial services, this loss of identity, MIT Age Lab are uncovering that, this, epidemic of boredom, loneliness, isolation, and then despair or depression. So the advisor's opportunity, again, the money is no longer in portfolio management. You can get, if you do risk models for your clients, the difference then is the impact you're having in the conversation. And blinding them with Monte Carlo simulation and deviation, it's little wonder that women aren't more engaged. Go have this conversation. But built into that, I've had a CFP capstone trainer who is practicing CFP say to me, we as advisors think we're having this conversation, but we're really not. And again, at what point does this nettle get grasped? Whether it's through the world of compliance, where is the thought leadership? Because the flip side, there is part of me, I used to talk to advisors about what are you doing not to be the next Blockbuster? And by that, I meant that if you considered Blockbuster was offered Netflix 3 times, turned it down 3 times, they couldn't see the future. And if financial services demands to keep going down this road of simply looking at finance, that's not what clients are looking for now. And again, step out of financial services and it's night and day. And, who's going to pick this ball up and run with it? Because they'll clean shop. The clients want their friends to benefit. They want to be engaged. It's multi-generational. I mean, again, what do we talk about? Oh, we want to engage next generations. It's an off-ramp for the G1, for the older advisors. And, you read about how 50% of advisors are going to retire, whatever that means, in the next 10 years. But how do you bring in the next generation of advisors who don't have market tenure? Well, change the conversation. Tell me about you. Let's not, as long as you're tracking, the software takes care of your projections, but let's really look at what longevity, not just longevity risk, but longevity opportunity. What lights you up? What does unlocking your bigger view on life look like? And make that an ongoing conversation.
Right. Bob, we lost you. I think we're seeing pockets of that, Jonthan, with younger advisors. At least when I talk to them about this topic and about the topic of retirement, it seems like it's striking a chord with younger advisors who are working with older clients. And I had an advisor not too long ago tell me that he was interested in this because, and this is more kind of on the retirement side of it, but he said, to me, I can't relate to these people because I'm in my mid-30s. The whole concept of retirement and what that means for people, no matter how long it is, just was foreign to him. So that's why he wanted to talk about it. And I think there are other younger advisors who are kind of getting that it's more about helping people with their lifestyle planning. And that's kind of the first side of it. And then the second side of it is, okay, how do we help you create a financial plan that supports what you want your lifestyle to be? And I think that's really what makes good longevity planning is encouraging people and helping them on all of these, again, all of these things that are going to happen when somebody starts work at 20 and lives to 110. Well, that's quite a different set of guidance and advice that people are seeking than starting work at 20, retiring at 60, and then just hoping to ride off into the sunset. It's just, to me, it's a whole different, it's a whole different way of thinking. And that's why I'm so intrigued by your mindset piece of this planning, because there's so much that goes into that, both from the positive side of it, which I think can, help people like this person who talked about the Merrill Lynch advisor that's obviously struggled in retirement. And I think if people can we can change that mindset about living longer, living better longer, that leads to just so many different opportunities for people.
Yeah, and Reed, I mean, the part of this is having fun. I mean, it becomes a fun conversation, and built into that, in the workshop I reference how over the last 6 or 7 years I've taken to asking advisors what level of joy, if 10 is high, including high net worth individuals, what level of joy do you feel your clients experience on a daily basis in the way of living? And the average has been a 4. The
Wow.
highest I've come across is a 7, and that advisor does meditations with their clients and things like that.
Okay.
But you think if people are wandering around, just because you've got a lot of money doesn't mean to say you're living a joyous existence.
Right.
And
Exactly.
this isn't about advisors having become life coaches and things like that, but it is going beyond just simply talking about money, because how can you connect money to a person's life if the person doesn't understand the life themselves?
Right. Exactly. All right. I think we've kind of reached our time limit for today. Jonathan, is there any final thoughts that you have? Anything that you'd like to add that we maybe didn't get to cover?
I don't think so. I mean, again, I don't know if I'm sort of allowed plugging or not. I've talked about workshops and things like that. I've mentioned the Flourishing Longevity Score. In the background, we have the InvestInU platform. And, for instance, I've had a Raymond James CFP using InvestInU for a year. And he came back and said, I could see all 8,000 Raymond James advisors using InvestInU with their clients. So again, we've got all this stuff bubbling away out there, partnering with folks like, you, Reed, and Bob. And obviously there are others in this space, but converting from the talking about it to the actionable deliverable. That's the crucial
Exactly.
thing.
Yeah.
And, continuing to influence. But I've loved this conversation. I really enjoyed, your curiosity and again, the engagement. It's so much fun to have a like-minded conversation.
Yes, I agree. I'm going to pull up Jonathan's contact information here for anybody who would like to get in touch with him. So we've got Jonathan's website there, should say website, longevityplanning.me. You can reach Jonathan at investinu.me, and then Jonathan's phone number there. You can find you on LinkedIn pretty easily, Jonathan, so people can
Correct.
reach you through that. So feel free to reach out to Jonathan if you'd like more information about his InvestInU and Flourishing Longevity program. I think that's it for today. Thanks everybody for joining us on this episode of Beyond the Numbers of Retirement and Longevity Planning. We'll see you next time. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.